Hey everyone, and thanks for jumping back into the Cryptoverse. Today, we're going to talk about Bitcoin dominance, and it has finally hit the 60% milestone. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and check out Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. It's time to take a deep breath because after about a 3 to 3.5 year journey, Bitcoin dominance has finally made it to the 60% milestone. So it's interesting that it finally made it here, right? After all this time, there's certainly times it felt like it wasn't actually going to make it, but patience paid off with it, and Bitcoin dominance finally hit 60%. Now, if you're a new viewer to the channel, the reason why Bitcoin dominance going to 60% was important and why tracking Bitcoin dominance was important was because if you are an investor in crypto at any given time, you want to know, what assets are going to perform the best, right? And if you find yourself in a situation where the least risky asset in crypto, which is Bitcoin, is likely going to outperform most of the rest of the market, but not all, but most of the rest of the market, then that's generally a trend that you want to be a part of, right? Because you're taking on less risk by buying Bitcoin compared to altcoins, and you're getting a higher reward, in fact. Because now that we fast forward all these years, Bitcoin is right around all time highs, but most altcoins are well below their all time highs. Even the altcoins that generally did well compared to many others, a lot of them are still below their all-time highs. This is nothing new. This happens every single cycle. Bitcoin usually hits new all-time highs first, and then the rest of the market catches up later, at least whichever altcoins are no longer relics of the prior cycle. So, now that Bitcoin dominance is at 60%, it raises the question, is that the top or will it go higher? Now, as I said, I don't know where the top is going to be. I think that 60% was a reasonable target when I set it 3 years ago, right? I mean, I thought 60% was a reasonable target. I will tell you how I arrived at that target, and then we will talk about, could it go higher? Um, and if so, how much higher could it go? But that's what I want to talk about. So, 60% was generally thought of by me as a realistic milestone because altcoins, when they go into a bubble against Bitcoin, which is what they did starting in March of 2021, the expectation, in my opinion, should be that eventually that bubble will pop and the altcoins will bleed back to Bitcoin and give those gains right back. So by identifying the Bitcoin dominance uptrend back over here, I converted in early 2022, I converted my altcoins to Bitcoin. And then in May of 2022, when ETH Bitcoin was at 0.075 or so, I converted a lot of my ETH to Bitcoin. And then I did a little bit later as well, closer to the merge. And then in late 2022, I bought Bitcoin with US dollars. And that's basically been my strategy for the last several years, right? Convert alts to Bitcoin, buy Bitcoin with US dollars when the risk levels allow for it, and just ride the Bitcoin dominance wave as high as it will let you go. Now, there were times when Bitcoin dominance went up while Bitcoin USD went down, and there are times that Bitcoin dominance went up while Bitcoin USD went up. But that was the whole point, right? Bitcoin dominance should go up no matter the direction of Bitcoin USD, right? Whether it goes up or down. So by buying Bitcoin, it gives you exposure to the upside so that you don't feel like you're getting left behind by the market if the market goes up, but it also minimizes your downside risk. There's a lot of altcoins that every time Bitcoin sneezes, the altcoins drop 20%, right? And then Bitcoin goes back up to where it was, and then the altcoin market is 20% lower. How many of you guys have altcoins that have done something like that? And it's not a knock, right? I've gone through that myself. And that's why I just decided this cycle to just stick with Bitcoin, at least until Bitcoin dominance reached 60%, right? So that was why I sort of came up with the 60% milestone, was because it's just basically retracing the move from that point. And it just seemed reasonable to me that dominance would then go back up to 60%. The reason I didn't say 73% was because the stablecoin market makes up a much larger portion of the market today than it did back then. For instance, if you were to look at USDT dominance plus USDC dominance, you will see that it's currently at around 6.5%. But when Bitcoin dominance topped in September of 2019, just after the first rate cut, dominance of stablecoins was only 1.5%. So the stablecoin dominance, just an approximation, USDT and USDC, is 6% higher today than it was back then. And that's a conservative estimate, right? Because there's other stablecoins as well that have contributed to the market cap of the stablecoin market. So 6% higher. So because of that, I did not think that dominance would go to 73%. Now, some people thought it would not make it to 60% because of the stablecoin market and because there's a lot of new cryptocurrencies being minted every day. But the argument against that idea is that, you know, if you think about all the money going into crypto as sort of like, it's going into a, let's say you have a slice of the pie, right? And Bitcoin is now 60% of the market. Just because you split up the rest, the remaining 40% into 10,000 new meme coins or 100,000 new meme coins, it doesn't mean that you actually have any more money going into those slices of the pie, right? So rather than all that money going into only a few meme coins, which is what previously happened in prior cycles, this cycle, you've basically had all this money going into thousands of different meme coins. So some of them do well, and then a lot of them just asymptotically go to zero against Bitcoin and the US dollar, right? They get rugged. So again, just because you slice the pie into smaller and smaller pieces doesn't mean that Bitcoin dominance can't just go back to where it was previously. But if you increase the market cap of stable coins, that actually can keep Bitcoin dominance when you include stable coins from going to, say, the same level that it was at in a previous cycle. One way to visualize this is to look at Bitcoin dominance excluding stablecoins, right? And you can see that it's actually been in a bull market since May of 2021. When you include stablecoins, Bitcoin dominance bottomed in September of 2022. But if you exclude the stablecoin market, which is arguably the better way to view the market, Bitcoin dominance actually bottomed in May of 2021, just after the first peak by Bitcoin. If you guys remember back in April, Bitcoin topped and then it crashed in May and then it rallied up to a slightly higher high in November of 2021. But even though it did that, Bitcoin dominance never took out that low, despite all the new altcoins that were created. And that's something to really think about. Despite in 2017 and 2018, dominance of Bitcoin went to 35%. That should be proof enough that just because you print more meme coins doesn't mean dominance has to respect that. Because even though there were a lot more altcoins created back over here, dominance actually put in a higher low, right? I mean, again, think about that for a moment, right? That should be proof right there that just creating more crypto, just because you're creating more altcoins doesn't mean that Bitcoin dominance has to respect that as if it's meaningful in terms of the overall market share. It doesn't care, if 10,000 new meme coins are created every single day, because there's no necessarily any more money going into those meme coins than would have gone into the meme coins that already existed. Hopefully that makes sense. But because the stablecoin market is a significant portion of the overall market cap now, it would make sense to assume that it might not actually get all the way back up here. And if you look at Bitcoin dominance excluding stablecoins, it's already at 64.4%. In fact, it passed 60% back in July. I made a video about it back then, but back in July of 2024, Bitcoin dominance excluding stables passed 60%. And arguably, dominance excluding stables is the more important metric, right? That's the more important metric here, not including stables. Because if you think about it, the reason, I talk about Bitcoin dominance is not because I want to know what the stablecoin market is doing. I don't really care what the stablecoin market cap is. I want to know what is the altcoin market doing with respect to Bitcoin. So by sticking with Bitcoin for the last 3 years, you were able to theoretically preserve the Satoshi valuation of your portfolio. The type of analysis that I do Some people really like it, and some people absolutely hate it. But I think the secret to the analysis that I do and where it starts to make a lot more sense is if you denominate your portfolio in Bitcoin, the analysis that I do, I think makes a lot more sense because Bitcoin is your unit of account, not altcoins and not US dollars, right? You think in terms of Bitcoin, right? If you go out and you buy groceries, right? You think about, oh, that's $200. Think about how much Bitcoin I can buy with that, right? If you go buy a car, like, oh man, that's like, that's a certain amount of Bitcoin, depending on how nice the car is, right? If you go buy a house, you're probably thinking, gosh, think about how much Bitcoin you could buy with that, right? If your unit of account is Bitcoin, then Bitcoin dominance matters to you. If your unit of account, if the denominator for you is US dollars, then you're probably not going to care as much about the type of analysis that I do because you're thinking about your portfolio in terms of something that's just going to be devalued forever, right? So why think about your portfolio in terms of US dollars when you can think about it in terms of Bitcoin? That is the point, right? Now, at any given time, I talk about the potential upside for Bitcoin and the risks involved. For instance, recently we've talked about the cyclical view of Bitcoin, right? And the cyclical view suggested that Bitcoin would get a rally around this time. If you look at, year-to-date ROI of Bitcoin in 2024 and you compare it to 2020, 2016, and 2012, just looking at that seasonality in prior halving years, that suggested that Bitcoin could go up in October. If you were to look at the ROI from the low, it suggested that Bitcoin would likely go up around this time. And we've been talking about this all year. I said back in March when gold broke out that Bitcoin USD would likely have about a 6 to 9 month consolidation phase before we get things moving again. It's already been about 7 months, almost 8 months. So you can see that that window seems like it was an appropriate amount of time, right? About 6 to 9 months. It's hard to nail these things down exactly, right? I can't know exactly how long it will take, but again, 6 to 9 months. And I gave that analysis because I was just looking at Bitcoin USD and basically saying, look, guys, in 2019, when a year the Fed cut rates, it took about 6 to 7 months for Bitcoin to break out. In 2024, what if it takes the same amount of time? Right? What if it takes about 6 to 7 months? So that was how I came up with the 6 months portion. The reason I came up with the 9 months was just in case there is some form of a landing, right? With the Federal Reserve and the macro stuff, right? If there is a landing, that's why I said 6 to 9 months. Now, what I have found throughout the years is a lot of people don't really like me talking about the downside risk. And back in March, they didn't like the idea of saying that Bitcoin could just bleed for the next 6 months. But I'm always going to talk about that, right? I mean, I think it makes sense as an investor to weigh the upside, weigh the downside. But as I told you guys 3 years ago, it does not affect me. I buy Bitcoin when the risk is below a certain risk level, regardless of what I think about the market. And furthermore, I also have been pretty clear that I would keep my portfolio Bitcoin heavy until 60% Bitcoin dominance. Now that Bitcoin dominance is at 60%, I have to start to reassess what I think will happen in the market. So, what I think will happen, I think that in 2025, Bitcoin dominance will go down. But it almost feels like an eternity between now and 2025. It's only 2 months, but it seems like it might go by very, very slowly, especially for people that really want to see Bitcoin dominance go down. Okay? So 60% was the milestone because that's where Bitcoin dominance is basically completing this, right? The other reason I thought 60% was reasonable was some level of confirmation bias. I think it's okay to sort of recognize when you have confirmation bias rather than pretend like it, everything just lines up perfectly. Last cycle, this is actually something that's really, really interesting, and it's kind of eerie how similar it is. But last cycle, once the dominance of Bitcoin started to crash in 2017, when it rallied up, it rallied to the 0.618 fib. And if you draw that out for this cycle, it just happens to correspond, to just above 60% Bitcoin dominance, right? What's really interesting is that Bitcoin dominance rallied to the 0.618 fib about 5 weeks after the first rate cut back then, right? In July. If you overlay interest rates to this chart, Bitcoin dominance topped the week of September 2nd. The first rate cut was, I believe, July 31st, I think, of that year of 2019. So it was about 5 weeks later where Bitcoin dominance topped at the 0.618. What's absolutely fascinating is the Fed cut approximately 5 weeks ago, right? It's October 29th. About 5 weeks ago was September 18th, approximately, right? It's just approximate, right? About 5 weeks ago was September 18th. So exactly 5 weeks after the first rate cut in 2019, Bitcoin dominance topped. Well, approximately 5 weeks at the 0.618. Now we're about 5 weeks after the first rate cut this cycle, and once again, Bitcoin dominance is at the 0.618. Isn't that really interesting? Now, the other interesting part of Bitcoin dominance is that you could have used it to tell you when the mid-cycle top of Bitcoin was actually going to occur. Because last cycle, when Bitcoin dominance rallied through the 0.5 fib, that actually corresponded to the mid-cycle top, or the top that occurred during quantitative tightening and high interest rates. And if you look back here, when Bitcoin dominance crossed through the 0.5 fib, right here, it wicked above it, that corresponded again to, if you want to call it, the mid-cycle top. The reason I call it the mid-cycle top is because normally in a bull market, Bitcoin puts in new all-time highs every month or two, right? But when you get rate cuts, or the anticipation of rate cuts, Bitcoin USD doesn't necessarily follow that trajectory, and you get a top that ends up being the top for far longer than most people think it's going to be the top. If you were to rewind the clock back in March, mid-March, if someone told you that by October 29th, Bitcoin would still not be at a new all-time high, you probably would not have believed them, right? If we're being honest, right? Most people probably would not have believed that idea that, when Bitcoin hit 73.8K back in mid-March, that we'd be sitting here late October of the same year and Bitcoin's at 72K, right? That probably wouldn't have been the first thing on your mind. But Bitcoin dominance crossing the 0.5 fib told you that that was the most likely outcome, because that's exactly what happened last cycle, right? When it crossed the 0.5 fib, that corresponded to sort of the mid-cycle top. And then Bitcoin bled for 6 months, and then it broke through the lower high structure, right? It broke through that lower high structure, and then, of course, we got a landing, right? So there's always a risk that we do get a landing, but at the end of the day, you can't constantly trade based on that idea. And I've said that for 3 years. If your unit of account is Bitcoin, right? If your unit of account is Bitcoin, then Bitcoin dominance is the key to unlocking the secrets of the cryptoverse. If your unit of account is US dollars, then you're probably going to think about Bitcoin dominance as something that doesn't really matter, right? One of the things that impacts Bitcoin dominance the most is the ETH Bitcoin valuation. Now, I have been pretty bearish on the ETH Bitcoin valuation for the last several years. I have been, right? There's no surprise. And, I've struggled with it myself, because I feel like a lot of people sort of misinterpreted my view as calling for, the death of ETH, and that sort of stuff. But the reality is this was a perfectly normal move by Ethereum. And the exact same thing happened in 2016 and in 2019. This was a perfectly foreseeable future for the ETH Bitcoin valuation if you were not married to your bias of the flippening, right? If you didn't think about that and you just thought about, it's the tightening cycle, we're likely going to see these higher market cap, cryptocurrencies bleed to Bitcoin, this was the most likely outcome. But I think where it becomes somewhat abstract for people and why they don't necessarily appreciate Bitcoin dominance is because when you look at the ETH Bitcoin valuation, you see 0.036. But a lot of people don't necessarily know what that means, right? It means that the price value of ETH compared to Bitcoin is 3.6%, right? 3.6%. But even that is somewhat abstract. The way that you can get through the abstract component of Bitcoin dominance is to take your favorite cryptocurrency on its Bitcoin pair and then go up here and put a 1 in front of it and division symbol, right? 1 parentheses ETH Bitcoin. And then you see a completely different chart, right? Now you can see that back in December of 2021, 1 Bitcoin was worth 11 ETH, but in October of 2024, 1 Bitcoin is worth 27 ETH. So now you can look at it and it makes a lot more sense. So by putting your ETH into Bitcoin back over here, you could leisurely convert back if you want to over here, right? And that way, you've essentially doubled up your ETH position by doing nothing more than sitting in Bitcoin. If you are an ETH maxi, you might think you always have to hold ETH no matter what, but I would argue that if you are objective about the market and not married to to that cryptocurrency, if you're objective and you're an ETH maxi, your goal, right, is probably to accumulate as much ETH as you can, right? And one way to do that during the 3 years that are not the post-halving year is just sit in Bitcoin. And now you didn't do anything. You didn't actually have to put another dollar into the Cryptoverse between November of 2021 and October of 2024, right? Almost 3 years later. And now somehow you're close to 3xing your ETH by doing nothing more than sitting in a lower risk asset, right? That is how you can make Bitcoin dominance less abstract, is to look at 1 divided by the altcoin on its Bitcoin pair. Now, I could go through a lot of other altcoins and I could go through a ton of the altcoins and show a very similar pattern, but I'm not going to, right? I'm not here to just go pick on the altcoin market. I have been very critical of the altcoin market for a long time because of this chart right here. Total 3 minus USDT divided by Bitcoin, right? I've been very critical of it for a long time. And the reason was because I thought that the most likely outcome was for alt Bitcoin pairs to bleed back down to the range lows, right? That was what I've suggested for a long time. As of today, alt Bitcoin pairs put in a new cycle low. So every single rally by the collective altcoin market against Bitcoin since 2021 has been nothing more than a bear market rally, as crazy as that may sound. I know it sounds crazy, but that's the reality, right? Every single rally by the altcoin market against Bitcoin for the last 3 years was a bear market rally. Now, there are some altcoins that's not true for, right? There are some altcoins that are in uptrends against Bitcoin. Some of them have been in uptrends against Bitcoin at different times in the cycle, but that is a fact that some alts have outperformed Bitcoin. But that was always going to be the case. And I said that back in 2021 and 2022 that my goal was to go with the easiest strategy, and the easiest strategy was just to put everything in Bitcoin and forget about everything else and say, I don't know which ones are going to outperform Bitcoin, but I'm just going to sit comfy in Bitcoin and wait for dominance to hit 60%. One thing that is a little surprising to me is that Bitcoin dominance is at 60%, but altcoins on their Bitcoin pairs are still at 0.36. And I have said for a long time that I think they will go to 0.25, right? Which would represent about another 27 to 28% drop. I will say this, right? I've been bullish on Bitcoin, sort of like blindly bullish. Um, maybe some people would call it toxically bullish on Bitcoin dominance for 3.5 years, right? I have to start shifting that view because I know, right, in the back of my mind, I know that in 2025, there is a high likelihood the dominance is going down. I just don't know what's going to happen between now and then, right? I don't. I wish I did, but I don't. 60% seems like a reasonable milestone to me. And if in a year you told me that 60% was the top, I would say great. That seems like it could have been the top, right? It seems like it would have been reasonable. If you told me that ETH Bitcoin, bottomed out between 0.03 to 0.04, I'd be like, yeah, that's where I thought it was going to bottom out, right? So to me, in a year, it probably won't matter, right? Whether it's 60% or slightly higher. In the short term, there's always a risk that dominance could go higher, especially with alt Bitcoin pairs this far off their low. If you were to just look at ETH Bitcoin, you could argue that it's gone on long enough, right? I mean, 0.03 to 0.04 was the target that I said for a long time. In fact, if you look at the ETH Bitcoin trend, if you look at sort of the prior breakdowns of ETH Bitcoin after sort of the double top pattern, here after breaking that range low set between the double tops, ETH Bitcoin dropped about 56%. That was in 2016. In 2019, ETH Bitcoin dropped about 32%. So far this cycle, ETH Bitcoin has dropped about 27%, right? So there does exist a world, and I'm not sure it's the most likely one, but there does exist a world where ETH Bitcoin bounces while alt Bitcoin pairs go down, keeping Bitcoin dominance from going up too much more, right? So like if ETH Bitcoin were to bounce, that could happen. But one thing to remember with ETH Bitcoin, I know a lot of people keep asking me like, is the low end? Is the low end? I don't know, guys. I don't know. I just think somewhere between 0.03 to 0.04 is the low. You're not going to get anything more concrete out of me with that idea. What I would say, though, is that one of the ways in the past when the market was telling us the low was in was when ETH Bitcoin rallied above its 50-day moving average after breaking below the range low, right? So after it broke through the range low, you can see that once ETH Bitcoin had that rally above the 50-day SMA, the low was in. That was in 2016. If you look at 2019, by the way, that trend line that I was looking at earlier from the percent difference, I guess for that first cycle, it was closer to 52% instead of like 56 or whatever I said. In this cycle over here in 2019, you can see that after the low was actually in, and not just sort of a fake low, ETH Bitcoin got a strong rally above the 50-day moving average, right? Do you see that? And so something similar has happened this time, right? I mean, you can see right here, ETH Bitcoin was trying to form a low. It got a nice little bounce, but it just kind of kept hugging that low, and then eventually it capitulated down. Now look at 2024. Same kind of thing happened, right? It was bouncing there, and then it just seems like it's capitulated down. So there does exist a scenario where ETH Bitcoin bounces sometime soon, and it's a sort of a headwind for Bitcoin dominance. So I would like to imagine there is a scenario where alt Bitcoin pairs break down to the range low, but Bitcoin dominance doesn't go up too much more because ETH Bitcoin is bouncing at a very timely point. You might argue that that doesn't seem very likely. And if I'm being honest, I would probably have to agree with that assessment, right? But the counterpoint is that altcoins against Bitcoin, they haven't really made that same move that ETH Bitcoin did. Now, you could argue that it's because ETH is weaker this cycle than the altcoin market, or you could argue that the process of events is just taking place in, out of order, right? Like this process by ETH Bitcoin could happen to the altcoin market. And it wouldn't be that surprising if something like that happened, right? I mean, if you were to look at some of these altcoins like BNB Bitcoin, it had a capitulation back in late 2023, right? You see that capitulation where it also was sort of hugging that low, and then it went into its final capitulation, and then it got a huge bounce. And even though it got a huge bounce, a lot of other altcoins just kept on bleeding to Bitcoin. So there is a world right? Where Bitcoin dominance doesn't go much higher than where it is right now, even if altcoins bleed back to Bitcoin. But I want people to be aware that there is a scenario, right? There is a scenario where Bitcoin dominance does go higher. My argument at this point is that the meat of the move for Bitcoin dominance is over. Okay? Dominance will probably go down in 2025. Predicting exactly where it tops is anyone's guess. 60% is good enough for me, right? You're not going to find me over here hammering down that it needs to go higher. I will admit that it could go higher if ETH Bitcoin continues to capitulate and it drags altcoins down, but I would also acknowledge that there are future scenarios where it doesn't go much higher than where it is right now. We do have a Fed meeting coming up next week, and so that could start to change things for Bitcoin dominance. Um, the thing to consider: last cycle, dominance topped after 50 basis points of rate cut. So it might have just been 25, but it topped in the month that the second cut arrived. And so let's just approximate that it took about 50 basis points or nearly there of the terminal rate back then, which was 250. Um, and that's what it took for Bitcoin dominance to top. And so I think some people got ahead of it and they were like, well, we already got 50 basis points this time. Does that mean dominance topped back in September? And I pushed back against that idea, primarily because dominance was not yet at 60%, but also because the terminal rate this time was 550 instead of 250. So back over here, 50 basis points out of 250 meant a lot more than 50 basis points out of 550. Okay? But we are about to get another rate cut, theoretically, coming up really, really soon. There is a 98.4% chance of a 25 basis point rate cut next week. And then we will find out, is that enough, right? Is 75 enough to, to really turn this thing around? And maybe it is, maybe it's not. I don't know. But the point is at this point, if you stuck with Bitcoin for the last 3 years, you are in a position of strength, right? And you can leisurely take on risk as you see fit. If instead you rode the altcoin market for the last 3 years, it's going to depend on which altcoins you decided to invest in, right? If you invested in a lot of the altcoins from 2021, you probably don't really feel like you're in a position of strength right now, right? Because now you're hoping that dominance doesn't go any higher. If you just stuck with Bitcoin and now that it's at 60%, you're like, all right, well, now I will start to look at the altcoin market. You're in a much, a much, like I would say you have much more strength right now than someone who was in the altcoin market. That's not true for everyone. There are some altcoins that have outperformed Bitcoin, and if you were in one of those, then you also probably feel like you're in a position of strength. And frankly, if you're in those, Bitcoin dominance probably doesn't mean as much to you. There are times in prior cycles where I sort of scoffed at the idea of Bitcoin dominance because I was in a few altcoins that were outperforming Bitcoin. But the longer I go through it, I just rather take the easy way and stick with Bitcoin and a Bitcoin dominance rally. I just think it makes the most amount of sense. And I think everyone probably could agree that most people, don't do well day trading altcoins, right? Or trying to time every little thing in the market. And so just sticking with Bitcoin is going to be the better thing for most people, including and especially myself. So I think the biggest interesting discussion right now, that we'll talk about maybe in the next video, because I don't want to go too much longer on this one, is which rally is Bitcoin dominance in, right? Is it in this one or is it in this one? And that's what I want to leave you with here. And that's what I think you really have to think about for the next couple of weeks or so. Because I get a lot of people asking me, like, is it alt season or is alt season about to start now that dominance is at 60%? What does that mean? There's two tops by Bitcoin dominance, right? So whenever the top occurs, you could argue that we will see that top again potentially about 1 year later, right? Whatever that top is, you could argue that there's a good chance we'll see that top again 1 year later. Um, and the question is, are we here or are we here? Because after this one, alt season was imminent. After this one, Bitcoin dominance went down, but it took a few more months for altcoins to go up on their USD pairs. Altcoins went up against Bitcoin, but they went down against US dollars because Bitcoin was dropping. So that's the important part to think about now, right? The cyclical view favors this peak, right? Because cyclically, this is when Bitcoin usually goes up in Q4 of the halving year. This is ROI from the low. You can see this is normally when Bitcoin goes up. And if you look at the year-to-date ROI of Bitcoin, what you will notice is that 2020, 2016, and 2012, if you look at it compared to 2024, normally it is at this point where Bitcoin really starts to move higher in Q4 of the halving year. So the cyclical view supports that this is the top that we're in. This top also occurred in December of the halving year, right? And we're not that far away from December of this halving year. So you could argue that this is the top we're currently in. The other view is this top, the first top, which occurs just after the first rate cut, right? So if you look at interest rates, you will see that this top right here occurred just after the first rate cut, which is where we are right now. I don't know which one. I think there's evidence to support both. The easiest thing to do up until now was just stay Bitcoin heavy until 60% dominance. Now we are at 60% dominance. So I think it makes sense to start thinking a bit more critically about where the market is going to go over the next few months. There's obviously the cyclical view, the seasonality, and in the short term, that does seem to be the one that is taking precedent right now, because you can see that I said back in March, about 6 to 9 months before Bitcoin continues, and I wasn't sure if the monetary policy view would sort of take hold now, this late in the game for Bitcoin USD, or if the cyclical view would. This was about 6 to 7 months before this breakout, right? And here, it's been about 6 to 7 months before this breakout. So it's been about, and of course, we had a pandemic-induced recession, which I'm not arguing that you should be planning for, right? If we do get a drop, it probably won't be as bad as that, because I doubt the unemployment rate is going to go to 10% overnight, right? I mean, the reality is that this is not the norm for economic downturns, when the unemployment rate just spikes to 10%, like practically overnight. So the cyclical view for Bitcoin USD seems to be playing out right here in terms of general seasonality, right? And that's what I wanted to make clear is I don't know which one's going to happen, but I'll stay Bitcoin heavy until at least 60% dominance, right? That was what I communicated to you guys over and over and over again. Of course, I'll talk about the downside risk. I think it's foolish not to, but that is the strategy, right? That was the strategy anyways, Bitcoin heavy until 60% Bitcoin dominance. What I am interested in now is, can Bitcoin continue to show this, this favorable seasonality, right? Until it deviates from this, it's dangerous to fade seasonality. It doesn't mean that seasonality will hold for the entire quarter, but it also doesn't mean that it won't either. So I would argue that as long as Bitcoin continues to sort of favor the seasonality view, then it makes sense not to fade it. But if Bitcoin gets a sharp rejection off one of these levels up in the 70K range and gets back below this line, right? If it gets back below that line, then you could argue that the Fed really does need to aggressively go to looser monetary policy to sort of help support the economy and risk assets, right? But again, that stuff is impossible to predict and to time. And so I think you need to have a strategy regardless of that. Okay, so that is my view right now. Right, the cyclical view seems to be the one that's currently leading. The interesting thing about it is, the monetary policy view last cycle, Bitcoin did not break through the lower high structure over here until QE began, right? So if you were to overlay total assets by the Federal Reserve, you can see that QE began back over here in September of 2019. That's when Bitcoin dominance topped. Um, and then Bitcoin USD broke the lower high structure after QE began. I wasn't sure this time if we had to wait for QE to begin before Bitcoin would break out of here or not. If you go back and watch the video I published a couple days ago titled Bitcoin Decision Time, I said just as much. I said, I don't know if we can get through the lower high structure before QE returns, but I'm going to remain Bitcoin heavy either way, because if we don't get through it, all it means is we get rejected and then we go back up and try again, right? And that's the argument, right? Is that yes, we get rejected, or we could get rejected, but even in that case, we still likely would go back up and try again until there's enough liquidity to really get through. So that's something I've been thinking about, because last cycle, we know that Bitcoin dominance did not actually top until QE returned, right? You see that? Like, dominance topped when QE began. And I've suggested that something similar could happen this cycle as well, right? You might not see dominance top until QE begins. But when you look at Bitcoin USD, it does put a question on that idea. Like, maybe there's a chance that it plays out somewhat differently. So far, Bitcoin dominance has been going up. And that's the point. I think that monetary policy affects altcoins on their Bitcoin pairs a lot more than altcoins on their USD pairs. The USD valuation of altcoins is more dependent on Bitcoin USD, but the valuation of altcoins on their Bitcoin pairs is more so dependent on monetary policy. And I think and that's exactly why, the jaws open between liquidity and Bitcoin, is because all that liquidity from the altcoin market just keeps pouring over into Bitcoin. And also, of course, you have the money going in from the ETFs as well, and the people that just buy Bitcoin, that just regularly DCA Bitcoin, those people too. Um, so yeah, I mean, that's where we are right now with Bitcoin. That's what I will be focusing on here over the next couple of months. Can Bitcoin continue to sort of ride that favorable seasonality? I think the only, obviously we got more macro data coming out this week. We got the unemployment rate coming up soon. And that should be somewhat interesting for the market. Hopefully it goes down. That would be more ideal. It's not really a good thing if people are getting laid off. If it does go up, that could temper risk assets for a little while, right? If it goes up. Though even then, I mean, there's times where, it goes up and risk assets do just fine, because then they just start pricing in more and more rate cuts. It's kind of like a game of chicken and mouse with the Fed, which has been really interesting to observe over the last several years. The other thing that I wanted to mention are specifically these alt Bitcoin pairs. Previously, I was always looking at, sort of this comparison over here and sort of the breakdown right here by alt Bitcoin pairs and comparing it to this over here. But I was looking at this a little closer, and recently I was realizing that there's kind of a similar structure that's forming by alt Bitcoin pairs just a little bit lower than this first structure up here. And you can see that in 2019, it was a Bitcoin rally that broke altcoins off their Bitcoin support level, right? And here, it is also a Bitcoin rally that is breaking these altcoins off of their Bitcoin support level. So it's really interesting that is still playing out, right? And it occurred right around the time of rate cuts and QE back in 2019. Obviously, it's occurring around rate cuts in 2024, but there still is no QE. Now, maybe we'll get QE, quantitative easing, soon, but in the last FOMC, in the write-up for it, in the press release, they said that, at least they were going to continue reducing their holdings. And so unless they change it next week, I guess you just keep assuming they're going to reduce, or they're just going to continue on with QT until proven otherwise. So yeah, That's where I am right now. I mean, this is a really important week because this is decision time, right? It really is. And what happens over the next week, what happens for the rest of this week, I think goes a long way in dictating the rest of the quarter, right? Because if the cyclical view can prevail, then Bitcoin has time to just keep on moving up into, into the into the end of the year, right? If the cyclical view can just simply continue to prevail. And again, as I said 2 days ago, risk assets need a reason to go down, not a reason to go up, right? Risk assets generally trend up. They don't generally trend down. They generally trend up. So they need a compelling reason to go down. And the only real risk right now, I suppose, well, I guess the two main ones to at least consider are first the breakdown of all Bitcoin pairs, right? Does it accelerate like it did over here, right? Does that start to accelerate? That could be one thing. And the other thing is the finalization of the inverted yield curve, right? So we've had an inverted yield curve for a long time. The 2-year already inverted the 10-year or uninverted the 10-year. The 3-month should be uninverting the 10-year sometime, in the next 2 to 3 months, right? I mean, the 3-month right now is at 4.6%. The 10-year is at 4.24%. So they've gotten a lot closer, but still a little ways to go. I would keep an eye on that. Those will be, the uninversion, whenever the uninversion happens, that might spook risk assets a little bit, right? But I would argue, at least for Bitcoin, that the first level of defense for Bitcoin is if there is a sell-off sometime later on, the first level of defense will just simply be breaking through, or trying to hold this, right? This lower high trend line, right? Can it hold that? That would be sort of the first line of defense. Obviously, if it falls through, then, it could come way back down there. But that would be the first line of defense for Bitcoin, which is something that at least has going for it, which most other cryptocurrencies don't, right? Most other cryptocurrencies are not anywhere near their all-time highs right now. So I would keep an eye on that, and see what happens there, and see if the cyclical view continues to prevail, or if monetary policy has something to say about it. But so far, just sticking with Bitcoin has been the easiest course of action. But, I do think it makes sense to really focus here on Bitcoin USD as it relates to Bitcoin dominance and alt Bitcoin pairs. To summarize, Bitcoin dominance is now at 60%, right? It's finally at 60%. This was the target for the last 3 years. Bitcoin dominance will likely go down in 2025. Okay? So it's hit my milestone. It will go down, in my opinion, in 2025. The biggest thing to think about now is what happens between right now and the beginning of 2025, right? There's a box here, right? Does it surge higher? Does it just kind of cool off here? This is where I think it will turn around, right? This right here is where I think dominance will turn around in terms of time, but where does it turn around in terms of actual valuation? I don't know, but I would say it probably makes sense to, to look for opportunities over the next couple of months, and try to find altcoins that are doing well in their Bitcoin pairs, and see, if you can find some good ones. But that's where I am right now, right? Dominance has hit the 60% milestone that I've been talking about for 3 years. It's possible for Bitcoin dominance to go higher, but there are, and again, I think the hard part for me in sort of justifying this is that alt Bitcoin pairs are still so far off their range low, right? So I am open-minded to Bitcoin dominance going higher than 60%, but I also would argue there are potential outcomes where alt Bitcoin pairs drop, but dominance doesn't go that much higher because, some of the higher market cap alts like Ethereum might start to do better against Bitcoin. In the short term, they're falling knives until proven otherwise. And that's why I said for at least ETH, I would track that 50-day moving average, because the last 2 cycles, the 50-day SMA was instrumental in telling us when the bottom was in, right? It's impossible to know when the bottom is occurring in real time. Maybe it's right now, right? I don't know. It's impossible to know in real time when it's occurring. But if you look at the 50-day moving average, it might tell you once the low is actually in, right? It would be sort of some level of confirmation that, hey, I didn't tell you that the 50-day SMA doesn't tell you when the low is occurring, but whenever ETH Bitcoin takes out that 50-day SMA, it probably means the low is in. So I think it starts to, it is starting to make sense, in my opinion, to hedge with Ethereum. Even though obviously I've presented my case for Ethereum going home in Q4. I know I've presented it many times, and Bitcoin dominance finally went home. So maybe it'll happen with ETH as well. But if you want to, hedge that view, which probably makes sense, then ETH does look increasingly more attractive to me as it drops in Bitcoin valuation. Now, of course, there's going to be a lot of Bitcoin maxis that have been my friend for the last 3 years that'll probably dunk on me for saying stuff like that, especially if ETH Bitcoin goes lower from here. But I've lived through these cycles long enough to realize that this process has happened for Ethereum 2 cycles in a row, and I don't see why this cycle should be any different. So while I will acknowledge ETH Bitcoin could go lower, I do think it will go up in 2025. So we'll see what happens, guys. Those are my thoughts on the market. Bitcoin dominance, 60%. It could go higher, but I'm at least satisfied with where Bitcoin dominance is. And I think it makes sense to start at least strategizing for how to take advantage of the market as Bitcoin dominance goes down, probably in 2025. But in the short term, seasonality still favors Bitcoin over alts. So it makes sense to follow that as well. Thank you guys for tuning in. Thanks for being part of the dominance journey to 60%. It was one crazy journey, and I do appreciate everyone who stuck around and saw it through and believed that it actually was the most likely outcome, even when it felt like, the dominance narrative was falling apart. So I really do appreciate you guys being here for it. And in future cycles, now that Bitcoin dominance can go up for a very long period of time, even when it feels like it's not, right? So that'll wrap it up for the video. Thank you guys for tuning in. Subscribe, give the video a thumbs up, and again, check out Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. See you guys next time. Bye.